It was Sabbath morning, the 2nd of April, and all was quiet along the lines. My battalion had been relieved from the front and was stationed a mile or so back in the rear of our main lines on the north side of the James River. At the usual hour for divine services, quite a goodly collection of our battalion had assembled in the 3rd Company, and a feeling discourse was delivered to them by our chaplain, Reverend Henry M. White, than whom there is no chaplain more popular in the army. How quiet and peaceful everything seemed. And yet, farther on, away off to the right across the James River, scenes were transpiring that would shake from center to circumference our now despondent Confederacy. Little did the pastor or the people think then that this was the last sermon to the 1st Virginia Artillery. Perhaps had he or we thought it, his discourse would have been more fervent and we more attentive. But we knew it not then, and after the benediction, many lingered to speak of matters spiritual and temporal, whilst others repaired to their respective commands. The calm peacefulness of that Sabbath morning made a vivid impression upon my mind that neither time nor circumstances can ever efface. A short time afterward, orders came for us to prepare to move to the front. This was only a precautionary order, and we thought but little of it. Many of our boys had gone into the city, and it was only a few miles off. And early in the afternoon, one of them returned in breathless haste, bearing strange tidings. Said he, "Richmond is wild with excitement. General Lee has met with a heavy reverse on the right, and Richmond will be evacuated in less than 24 hours. At first, we paid but little attention to this information, considered by us as nothing more than a Sunday rumor. But others soon began to come in, and all bore the same sad tidings. How like a thunderbolt it came, and we, unprepared for the fact. In solemn groups of 5 and 10, the men collected, discussing the probable result of such a move as the forced evacuation of our metropolis. Sorrow was depicted among every countenance, but there was also the stern resolve and determination to follow the flag of our noble Lee so long as it waved, and fall, if fall we must, under the blood-stained banner of the Army of Northern Virginia. Noble banner, so oft triumphant and so deeply dyed with the blood of fallen followers. Ere long, a week hence, and thou shalt trail in the dust of defeat. But we that are permitted to remain with thee to the bitter end, even until there is no hope left, will feel no humiliation when thou art folded forever." There was no longer a doubt of the fact that we had to surrender Richmond. Yes, a noble old city that for 4 long and bloody years had withstood the powerful combinations of our relentless foe. Our lines on the right were totally swept away, our losses very severe, and we were outnumbered on every side. Still, we had received no definite orders as to when or where we should move, and in sorrow the day wore on. As most of our horses were still absent, and that was the case with nearly all the artillery of our army, we could only take with us 2 caissons to our company, and then have but 4 horses each to our 4 Napoleons, very heavy guns, which should never be moved with less than 6 horses. The Rockbridge artillery have 4 guns, the Powhatan artillery 3 guns, Salem artillery 4 guns, the 3rd Howitzers 4 guns, making a total of 15 guns, commanded by Colonel R.A. Hardaway, he having returned from furlough a few days since. Our commissary has no transportation for rations, and they are issued to us indiscriminately, each man taking as much as he can carry, none of us knowing when or where they will be again issued. About 10 o'clock at night, orders came for us to move on to Richmond as rapidly as possible and cross the James River at Mayo's Bridge. Everything now assumed the customary bustle and confusion of a camp about to be permanently abandoned. Captains gave orders to lieutenants, and they to sergeants, while sergeants called out lustily for out-of-the-way drivers, who were busily engaged in collecting a variety of plunder and superabundance of rations, for the hauling of which there was no transportation. Everyone had free access to as much meat, meal, molasses, flour, etc. as he wanted. About 11 o'clock, we took the road and moved rapidly towards the city. I started with 20 cannoneers to my gun, but when we had nearly reached the city, only 2 of them could be found, one of whom was quite lame, and the other so lazy that if he started to run, he would be too lazy to stop. These boys had all gone on ahead of the company to bid their friends and parents farewell, and as I had some friends in the city whom I wished to bid farewell, I turned the command of the 4th gun over to the lame cannoneer, and I left also. As I entered the city, by the way of rockets, scenes of confusion met me on every side, and though it was after midnight, crowds of men, women, and children of every hue and size thronged the streets, bearing away upon their shoulders all kinds of commissary stores. Whether these things were issued to them or had been stolen by them, I had not the heart to inquire. Armed men, citizen guards, were marching through the streets and emptying into the gutters all the liquor they could find, while beastly sots followed in their wake, and literally wallowing in the mire of inebriation drank deeply from this reeking, seething, poisonous stream, and the fumes thereof ascending mingled with the curses of strange women and of reeling, staggering, drunken men. All the private dwellings were lighted up, and told of the anguish, the suffering, and the pain of parting then taking place. For from nearly every dwelling a loved one was going forth from his home, and he was leaving all behind him. I soon bade my friends farewell, not knowing that I would ever see them again, and rejoined my company on 14th, Pearl Street, near Mayo's Bridge. Forward, 3rd Company, we were marching away from all that we cherished. For 4 years I had stood the storm of battle, and had seen men fall around me as the leaves from the forest trees before the autumn wind. But that night my heart was faint and weary. It was full to overflowing, and I wept like a child. 3 times had we, as a company, marched through noble old Richmond since the war commenced, and now we knew another flag would in a few short hours float triumphantly over the hills where but today the flag of Dixie was floating. We lingered not to participate in or to witness the shamefully disgraceful proceedings that took place a short time after we left, but in silence and in sorrow we marched on to the sound of the night winds sighing through our streets that ere long would ring with the shout of a shameless mob and roar with the desolating flame. No woman's hand waved us a parting adieu as we sped onward. No maiden's eye sparkled a farewell and a hope for the future. No matron or sire bending neath the weight of years bade us Godspeed, for the weak and defenseless were weeping in their desolated homes, and thus we left them. All night long we marched, and on the morning of the 3rd we halted a few miles from Branch's Church, went into camp about 3 o'clock in the afternoon at Tomahawk Church, and remaining there all night, resumed our march at 3 a.m. on the 4th. I was utterly broken down and did not get up until several hours after our battalion had resumed its march. However, I caught up with it directly as our column was moving very slowly. During the day, I stopped with a member of my company at the house of his brother, where I met several very companionable young ladies and had a good dinner. After dinner, we sang a few patriotic songs and then moved on. One cannot remain away from his command now, for no one knows what a day or an hour will bring forth. Wednesday, April 5th, marched all day and night, passed through Amelia Courthouse, and there found the enemy pressing us closely. A short distance in front of our battalion, beyond the courthouse, a brigade of Federals dashed into our lines, and somewhat of a fight ensued, Mahone's division driving them back. Thursday, April 6th, the enemy had reached Burkeville Junction ahead of us, and we must take another direction towards Lynchburg, I presume. The enemy made a bold dash upon our column today near Deatonville, Amelia County. Our guns were rapidly brought into battery, and for a time we thought a heavy fight would take place. After an hour's engagement, we drove them off and resumed our march. Matters now began to assume a very serious aspect, and later in the afternoon a heavy fight occurred in our rear, in which we were most seriously handled. The march now assumed every appearance of a rout. Soldiers from every command were straggling all over the country, and our once grand army was rapidly melting away on every side. The Federals were capturing our wagon trains, artillery, etc., and in the meantime picking up thousands of our men who were too nearly starved to fight. Marched to the High Bridge over the Appomattox, reaching that point late at night, remaining there until next morning when we moved in the direction of Farmville. Friday, April 7th. Moved within 2 miles of Farmville, where we halted to rest. Most of us busied ourselves in preparing a snack composed of anything we could get. I had finished my lunch, slapjack and water, and was lying on the ground, quietly taking my ease, when all at once a commotion arose, and the drivers commenced hitching up in a hurry. For once, the gallant, though lazy, 4th Detachment was on time. There was no hallooing for Jack Crump. Jack was ready, and everybody else was ready, and we moved out into the road without regard to company or battalion order. There was necessarily much confusion, and I had received no special orders, but I knew something was wrong. In the scramble, my gun occupied the 3rd place at the head of the battalion. We moved rapidly. I was ahead of and separated from the balance of my company, and no commissioned officer was with me. Finally, an officer from the Salem Artillery rode up to me and said, "White, you had better keep your eye upon a fine horse. You may need him presently." I replied, "I expect as much." We were moving to the right of Farmville, a short distance in Cumberland County, and through a densely wooded swamp, 2 guns belonging to the Salem Army were in my front, and though at the head of the battalion, neither field nor company officers were with them. I stopped to get a drink of water, and in so doing, I noticed that no other guns were following me. An orderly rode up to me and said, "Colonel Hardaway says that you have taken the wrong road. Get back into the other road." I looked back, and that which I had been expecting for some time was at its height. A stampede had taken place. Men and horses were dashing furiously through the woods. Instead of obeying Colonel Hardaway's order, it flashed through my mind, if I could move on this by-road, the enemy, if any there be near at hand, would follow the main column, and I might easily escape with my gun. So I gave my drivers the order to trot march, and away we went at a swinging pace, the Salem artillerist obeying my orders also. However, there was a wagon train in our front, Captain R.L. Christian's, and that brought us to a halt. The panic was spreading amongst his drivers, who had halted, unhitched, and were preparing to spike their mules, I reckon. I prevailed upon them not to desert their train, but to move along, at least until some of us had seen the enemy, or had heard a shot fired, neither of which had been done as yet. We moved on as fast as we could, and every now and then men from our main column would come in telling us of the stampede, but not one of them had seen a single sign of a Yankee or had heard a single shot fired. I was fully convinced now that the whole thing was caused by improper information and that the enemy were not in 2 miles of us. The drivers, having according to orders cut their traces and, having been ordered to take care of themselves, were doing some John Gilpin horsemanship through the woods, and having no officers with them, were at a great loss to know what to do. I was fully satisfied that there had been no enemy within striking distance of our battalion, and that if they, the drivers, were sent back immediately, the abandoned guns could all be saved. Therefore, whenever I came back in contact with one of our battalion drivers, I sent him back to the guns, which order was pretty generally obeyed. A few moments afterwards, our acting chief of artillery, Colonel Thomas H. Carter, came up, and I reported to him that I had disobeyed Colonel Hardaway's order and had saved 3 guns, also adding that I had taken upon myself the authority to send back to the abandoned guns all the drivers and horses belonging to our battalion, believing the guns could yet be saved, though the orders were peremptory to spike them in case we had to abandon them. He commended me for my action. April 8th, Saturday. Of course, I was much pleased at having saved my gun, and that my company had gotten another, but I also knew it was only useless trouble to bring those guns off the field. It is impossible for us to reach Lynchburg. The question of our surrender is now one of time only. Marched to within 4 miles of Appomattox Courthouse and halted about 2 p.m. Later in the afternoon, firing is heard immediately in our front, and soon we hear that the enemy have attacked and captured a park of our artillery commanded by General Lindsay Walker, amounting to some 30 or 40 guns. No infantry was supporting this artillery, and though the artillerists made a gallant resistance, yet the most of them had to surrender. Some got off with their guns and buried them shortly afterward. Among the latter was 1st Company Richmond Howitzers. The 2nd Company Howitzers at the evacuation of Petersburg were given muskets and have been doing infantry duty ever since. To say they did their duty well is to say no more than we expected of them at Sailor's Creek in Amelia County. They had fought the enemy most gallantly, their loss being very severe. They did not know how to run. At this place, one of their lieutenants, Henry S. Jones, fell mortally wounded. He was a brave and gallant soldier and had served faithfully with that company during the entire war. So near the end, and yet to fall. At nightfall, we buried several guns belonging to our battalion, and afterwards many of us gathered around our campfires discussing our probable fate. It was now apparent to all that we could hold out but a few hours. Men and horses were utterly worn down by fatigue, loss of sleep, and hunger. Thousands were leaving their commands and wandering about the devastated country in quest of food, and they had no muskets. Each hour the enemy was drawing his coil around us more closely. April 9th, 1865. We started early and moved in the direction of Appomattox Court's house. When reaching that place, it was evident we could go no farther, for the enemy, cavalry, infantry, and artillery, and countless thousands were on every side. A shell comes hurtling down our line, another and another follow last and follow faster. Just as cheerfully and just as defiantly as at Bethel 4 years ago, when our hopes were big with the face and fame of a newborn nation, do our boys go forth to meet them, and our guns hurl back their shot and shell. We were but a little band standing there in the soft spring light of that Sabbath morn. They were as the sands upon the seashore, or as the leaves upon the forest trees. The flag of the Army of Northern Virginia, under whose silken folds so many a gallant comrade, friend, and brother fell, all tattered and torn but never dishonored, around whose broken staff so many happy memories cluster, is floating above us for the very last time. The fighting ceased, and soldiers wept. Then rode adown our lines that peerless general, Robert Edward Lee, his head all bared, and his noble face all clouded with a sorrow deeper than tongue can tell or pen can paint. It is a wonder, then, that strong men grown old in wars, weep like children, and tearfully turning from to them, saddest sight on earth, silently prepare to go back to their desolated homes. Ah, neither time or sorrow can erase from memory's page the bitterness of that day.